Good news, everyone! We've got more Kenneth Burke and his one simple insight that changed everything. About 5 years after the publication of A Grammar of Motives, Kenneth Burke published a follow-up work called A Rhetoric of Motives. Of course, we've talked about his grammar on the show before, but if you ask me, his rhetoric is one of those cases where the sequel is a lot better than what came before. And Burke's insights in this book had a huge implication for the modern understanding of rhetoric. As we'll see by the end of this video, Burke played a key role in changing the study of rhetoric from something that focused on a very particular kind of discourse to something that was focused on pretty much just about anything. So let's take our first steps into seeing what this book is all about. In the first chapter of the book, Burke points out that rhetoric arises because of the divisions that exist among people. He says, if men were not apart from one another, there would be no need for the rhetorician to proclaim their unity. And we've talked about that idea before. There's no need for rhetoric where people already agree, but Burke adds an interesting wrinkle to our understanding of division by saying there would be no strife in absolute separateness, since opponents can join battle only through a mediatory ground that makes their communication possible. So of course there's nothing to fight about when we already agree about everything, but there's also nothing to fight about when we disagree about everything. And that might sound a little strange at first, but it reminds me of something that I learned once in a semantics class. Here's a list of family relations. Our job is to figure out how these words are related to each other. So we could add columns that describe different aspects or features of each word. For example, we could decide to classify them by sex and say the term either refers to a female person or not. We could also use age as an important characteristic. Do the terms sit on the older or younger side of the line? And then we could differentiate these terms by whether they refer to a direct relationship or not, in the sense that son is a direct descendant of mother, but not of uncle. With that matrix outlined, we can fill in our pluses and minuses. This is a tool that semanticists call feature analysis. We're pulling apart and identifying the individual features of each word's meaning. And with that, take a look at the analyses for mother and nephew. These terms have nothing in common. One is all pluses and the other is all minuses. But you would also be hard-pressed to say that nephew is the opposite of mother. In fact, if I had asked you at the beginning what the opposite of mother was, you might have said father, and that would have been very reasonable. This chart does not show us that nephew is the real opposite of mother. Instead, it shows us that opposites have most of their features in common, differing in this case in only one important way. If things are too different, we can't perceive them as opposites because there isn't a strong enough basis for comparison in the first place. So Burke's insight that rhetoric works where there's division, but not too much of it, is actually a really valuable one. First of all, it shows us where rhetoric is useful at all, but it also reminds us that we have a lot more in common with our rhetorical opponents than we sometimes think. For example, Republicans in the United States spend their time debating Democrats and not members of the United Kingdom's Labour Party, because Republicans and Democrats have enough in common to make their disagreements meaningful. In other words, rhetoric gives us a useful tool for resolving our meaningful divisions, the kinds that arise between people who still have a lot of important elements of their identities in common. The first chapter of A Rhetoric of Motives is really dedicated to proposing and explaining the term identification, which Burke argues is at the heart of rhetoric's usefulness for resolving divisions. As he puts it, identification is affirmed with earnestness precisely because there is division. Identification is compensatory to division. So if you have division, the tool you need to resolve that division is identification. And Burke explains identification very abstractly by saying, A is not identical with his colleague B, but insofar as their interests are joined, A is identified with B. Or he may identify himself with B even when their interests are not joined if he assumes that they are or is persuaded to believe so. Now, it would be easy to overthink things at this point, but our common way of using language can be really helpful here. If you identify with someone, you see that they have something in common with you. That is, you see that you share some aspects of your identity, and that's basically what Burke is after. And Burke explains that we identify with people based on our shared qualities or properties. So we could identify with people who share our age, our profession, our gender, or even our taste in music. Anything that we have in common with another person can serve as an opportunity for identification. And believing that you identify with someone is just as valid as actually identifying with them, and that makes sense. If people only believe that they have something in common, they can still work together just as well as if they actually had that thing in common. In either case, the outcome is the same. Identification then works by drawing people's attention to what they have in common, so you can resolve a division by getting people to value their similarities over their differences. For example, after a national crisis, political rivals may decide to work together because they identify more strongly as citizens of the same nation than as members of different parties. In such a case, identification resolves their division and makes it possible for them to work together. Or, to go back to our semantics example, mother and father might be opposites in terms of sex, but they can identify with each other generationally and leverage their shared identities in the work of parenting. Identification doesn't magically remove their division, but it does highlight their similarity, making those shared qualities more important than their differences. Once they have a basis for identification, they can work together in practical ways. So Burke's insight is useful because he points out that identification is the starting place of rhetoric. That is, before you can persuade someone to do something, you need to get them to identify with you or your cause in some way. When we start thinking about identification, we're really thinking about our attitudes and our feelings and about how rhetoric can influence the way that we think and feel about an issue before we ever do anything about it. Before Burke, people who studied rhetoric studied persuasion, the practice of using language to get people to do things. After Burke, though, rhetoric became the study of identification, which is something a little different and perhaps a little more nuanced. Burke explains, all told, persuasion ranges from the bluntest quest of advantage, as in sales promotion or propaganda, through courtship, social etiquette, education, and the sermon, to a pure form that delights in the process of appeal for itself alone without ulterior purpose. And identification ranges from the politician who, addressing an audience of farmers, says, "I was a farm boy myself," through the mysteries of social status to the mystic's devout identification with the source of all being. While persuasion is focused just on actions and outcomes, identification is focused on attitudes, perceived commonalities, and all of the things that go on in our heads before we ever actually do anything. When a politician says, "I was a farm boy myself," he isn't explicitly telling farmers to vote for him, but he is saying that he has something important in common with those farmers. He knows how they live and what they value, and that could lead them to believe that he'll favor policies that would benefit those farmers. So before the politician ever says, "Vote for me," he's already resolved the significant potential division by emphasizing an important similarity between himself and his audience, which makes it more likely in the end that they will vote for him. Similarly, before an advertiser ever tells you to buy their product, they'll probably try to get you to identify with a certain lifestyle or person, and then present their product as the key to realizing that attractive lifestyle. And it's this move that makes Burke's work so consequential. Instead of just studying speeches and documents that were overtly persuasive in their efforts to get people to do something, rhetoricians after Burke have studied all kinds of texts, media, and objects in order to understand how they shape and influence our identities and attitudes. For example, a poem might not be persuading its audience to do something, but it is certainly leading them to identify with a particular perspective or attitude towards something, like plums or old glassware. In that sense, even the least persuasive poem is still deeply rhetorical. With Burke's idea of identification, then, we can talk about rhetoric showing up in more than just presidential speeches. In fact, we can see it and use it just about everywhere. Burke was primarily a critic, so he used his rhetorical theories to analyze rhetoric from the perspective of the audience. He wanted to understand how rhetoric worked on people so that people could defend themselves against abuses of rhetoric, and since he was writing after World War II, it's really not hard to understand why. But on this show, we're more interested in rhetoric from a writer's perspective. So what insights can we gain from this first chapter of A Rhetoric of Motives? Well, first, we can understand that when we disagree with others, we still have a lot more in common than we might think. We might not agree about a particular policy or practice or belief, but there is far more that we agree with our readers on than not. So when we're trying to persuade someone, it's beneficial to look for what we share in common and use that as a starting point for persuasion. In other words, you don't usually have to do anything complicated to create common ground with a difficult audience. Instead, just look for the commonalities that already exist, and then get to work showing why those similarities are more important than your divisions. Of course, Burke points out that rhetoric begins with identification. So before you even think about what you want your audience to do, think about what your audience identifies with already and consider ways that you could encourage them to identify with your perspective more strongly. Effective rhetoric isn't really about beating someone into giving up their point of view. Instead, it's about showing them that you're actually on the same team working together. If you know what you and your audience have in common, then you can use those similarities as persuasive leverage. Adapt your writing so that it shows your readers how your vision aligns with their identities. You're not really challenging them or fighting with them, you're connecting with them in a way that transcends your differences. It's a little anticlimactic to say that you want your audience to identify with you before you try to persuade them, but that's what an understanding of identification amounts to at its most basic level, and it really is as simple as that. People are far more likely to be persuaded by your argument when they see you as a like-minded ally instead of as an enemy. Now, it could go without saying that there's plenty more to talk about in relation to identification and the rhetoric of motives. We'll continue this conversation in a later video, but this should be enough to get you started on thinking about how rhetoric influences and shapes the ways that we relate to other people by emphasizing our shared qualities. With this knowledge, you'll be better equipped to respond to the rhetoric that comes your way and to use it effectively and responsibly. In the meantime, though, we've got other interesting things to talk about next week, and I'm excited to see you then.